30 years ago, Europe was hit by a new type of terrorist. Young, idealistic, left-wing, and incredibly violent. For the Red terrorists, revolution was the end, and any means were justified in reaching it.
From 8 people involved, 8 people said, yes, he has to die.
There were 2 of us shooting into each car. I've got to say to myself that I killed 2 people.
This is the story of how revolutionary dreams turned to terror, of the terrorists who murdered and maimed in the name of revolution, and of their successors who continue the struggle to this day. The story begins here. This is Cuba. To some, a land of salsa, sun, and cigars. To others, the birthplace of a brand of far-left revolution which has been exported from Berlin to Bogota and inspired thousands to kill. In January 1959, 2 young men rode into the city of Havana. Together with a small band of ragged revolutionaries, they'd succeeded in overthrowing Cuba's right-wing dictatorship. One of these men, Fidel Castro, would go on to lead the Cuban nation, and for the next 40 years would become America's public enemy #1. The other would eclipse even this: Ernesto Che Guevara.
Guevara was mythical. In other words, he had the ideology and the adventure, and it doesn't get better than that. He was a double myth. Communism on one side and daring on the other.
Che Guevara was immortalized by his death in 1967, while fighting for revolution in Bolivia. He became a symbol for aspiring rebels determined to tear down capitalist states all over the world. In fact, after Cuba, his own attempts at sparking uprisings in Africa and South America were failures. But he left one enduring success: his writings. Che's guerrilla warfare, published in 1960, became the Bible for revolution. The year after Guevara died, 1968, the world seemed to explode. The escalation of the war in Vietnam, the assassination of Martin Luther King, Soviet tanks rolling into Prague. From Paris to Washington, students took to the streets, rallying to the image of Che and the protest songs of Bob Dylan. They thought they could literally change the world. Among them was a young German, Peter Jürgen Buch, who would later become a kidnapper, a bomber, and a gunman.
Those young people on this day had the feeling it just need one step to reach revolution. Many had the idea, if we wouldn't reach it, there won't be a second chance in the future.
Another young idealist was Valerio Marucci. He would later become a terrorist assassin.
1968 exploded onto the world, and I was swept up in it. It was like a tidal wave that carried me through to the very end. I was a communist by nature, but then I also had other passions. My greatest idol back then was Bob Dylan, much more than Guevara. But then Guevara was murdered and Bob Dylan wasn't. And I was really affected by Guevara's death.
The flame of revolution was lit by different sparks in different countries across the globe. In Germany, it was guilt about the Nazi past.
For me, it all started with a conflict at home. I asked my father what he didn't do in those Nazi time. And as many fathers around in Germany at that time. He wouldn't like to answer. Well, of course, I started to put more questions to him. I was angry. I was upset about the way he tried to get away with it.
Che Guevara had written that just a small band of radicals, suitably motivated, could overthrow an entire state. A few angry young Germans, like Peter Jürgen Buck, took this literally. A militant left-wing group called the Red Army Faction, more commonly known by the names of two of its members, Andreas Baader and Ulrike Meinhof, was formed in 1968. It began by setting fire to department stores and soon moved on to bombings and shootings. Then, in 1972, after the Baader-Meinhof leaders were imprisoned, a handful of their followers began a killing spree that was to last for the next 5 years.
Of course, we thought we had the right to change things. Of course, we thought we had to fight against those Nazi guys still in power in Germany, and we had the feeling the moral is on our side and the future too.
In September 1977, Buck and 3 others set out to kidnap a former SS officer turned industrialist, Hans Martin Schleyer. They were on the road to murder. Hans Martin Schleyer seemed the perfect target for the Baader-Meinhof terrorists, a former Nazi and now a leading member of the German establishment. But in order to kidnap him, they first had to eliminate his armed bodyguards.
From my point of view, they were soldiers. So I thought we had the right to attack them. It was a real street fight. I don't know if I have killed somebody. Maybe I've killed them all. I don't know. Really, I don't know.
And what about Schleyer? Was he a civilian or a soldier to his attackers?
In my mind, the former SS general and now leader of the West German Industrial Society was a war criminal. A war criminal that never was put to court. But he was not a civilian.
While thousands of police officers searched for the kidnappers, Buck and his comrades threatened to kill Schleyer if the Baader-Meinhof leaders weren't released from prison. Then, 43 days after the kidnap, something totally unexpected happened, which would prove fatal for Hans Martin Schleyer. 4 Palestinian terrorists, sympathetic to Baader-Meinhof, hijacked a Lufthansa Boeing 737 shortly after takeoff from Rome Airport. They demanded that Baader-Meinhof's leaders be released from jail in Germany. But the hijack failed. That evening, the Baader-Meinhof prisoners committed suicide in their cells. Their followers believed it was state murder. The next day, they decided that Hans Martin Schleyer would have to pay for it.
We had a kind of questioning inside the group, and from 8 people involved, 8 people said, yes, he has to die. He was brought to a place near the German border on the French side and was shot and left behind.
Who pulled the trigger?
I don't give you any names.
During the 1970s, the Baader-Meinhof group took nearly 30 lives and created a climate of fear throughout German society. By the end, their ideals of revolution had been eclipsed by methods which had come to mirror their Nazi fathers.
One of the things we found out about ourselves is that we were indeed the sons of our fathers. We reached very quick the same point where we said all possible actions are okay if you reach your target. All losses are okay if you reach your target. And it was quite the same thing our fathers said.
Buch served 18 years in prison for terrorist offences. Without its leaders and consumed by violence, Baader-Meinhof fell apart. But the revolutionary ideas they had distorted to their own agenda were still gathering steam elsewhere. In the 1970s, Italy was in turmoil. Fascists and communists were slugging it out on the streets. As in Germany, a hardline, hard-left group had emerged from the mass protest of 1968 to form a terrorist faction. They were called the Red Brigade, and they hoped to trigger a revolution. In their most notorious attack, 5 men were gunned down on the Via Fani in Rome. Valerio Marucci was one of the gunmen. He returns with us to speak for the first time at the scene of so much bloodshed.
For me, at the time, these things were justified and justifiable. The fact that people have died here is painful for me. The memories thicken, become more immediate and closer. It's partly horror about what happened, and partly it's guilt for the role that I played in what happened. It's painful to remember, so I'd really prefer it if we didn't stay here.
Quindi io ho scelto le Brigate Rosse soprattutto per...
I chose the Red Brigades, above all, as a way to keep the revolution going. They were the last option left for me in order to keep being militant.
By the mid-1970s, over 100 members of the Red Brigade had turned to kidnapping, maiming or assassinating members of the establishment. The government was forced to classify them as a new kind of threat.
Noi li abbiamo chiamati terroristi.
We called them terrorists because it was easier to mobilize public opinion without giving sociological and political explanations. Really, they were left-wing dissidents. They were Marxists and Leninists outside their time, who tried, using terror tactics, to stir up a knee-jerk reaction from the government.
In the spring of 1978, the Red Brigade decided to attack the very heart of the state. Their target was Aldo Moro, a former prime minister and leader of Italy's ruling party, the Christian Democrats. Because of Italy's continuing unrest, Moro had made an historic agreement with the Communist Party to give them a voice in government. The Communists accepted. But to the Red Brigade, it was a sellout. Their response was to kidnap Aldo Moro.
L'obiettivo del sequestro Moro era...
The aim of the Moro kidnap was to make the state collapse by creating as many contradictions as possible between the political parties.
Poi l'organizzazione...
Then came the organization of the operation itself.
Abbastanza lunga.
It was long and complicated.
Complessa.
It's always been very important to me that the plans are perfect.
Fare dei piani perfetti.
Morucci was one of a small team led by Mario Moretti, a core member of the Rome column of the Red Brigade. For more than 5 months, they kept a close watch on the Moro household and calculated that the best place to intercept Moro's heavily guarded motorcade was at the stop sign of a crossroads on the Via Fani.
Eravamo convinti che fossero poliziotti.
We were convinced that Moro's escort were super specialized police. And so it's not as though we were trying to kill a local police officer, a Bobby. We were targeting anti-terrorist personnel. And that obviously made it easier for us to make the psychological leap towards doing something much more bloody.
On the morning of the 16th of March 1978, the Moro family began an apparently normal day in Rome.
My father usually started working later and finished later than us. He worked strange hours, so we'd all go out between 8 and past, same thing that morning, and then he left at about 9.
Moro's 2-car motorcade left his home and drove off towards the Via Fani. When they stopped at the crossroads, the Red Brigade attacked.
Four of us, dressed as Alitalia pilots, ran out from behind the hedges of the bar that was on the corner and shot at the 2 cars until we got rid of the whole escort squad. There were 2 of us shooting into each car, so next to me there was another guy. I've got to say to myself that I killed 2 people.
That day I was somewhere without a phone, but my friends knew where I was and came to tell me that something had happened. I went back and found tremendous confusion, chaos. We couldn't understand exactly what had happened, whether he'd been kidnapped or killed. Only as the hours passed, we gathered that there'd been a kidnapping and all the bodyguards had been slaughtered.
For 2 days, there was silence. Then the Red Brigade issued a communiqué enclosing a photo of Moro taken in what they called the People's Prison. 13,000 police were mobilized every day in Italy's largest ever manhunt. But Aldo Moro was not far from home. The so-called People's Prison was in a tent, in a soundproofed room, in an affluent suburban apartment block in Rome. It was a location so unlikely that it didn't occur to the police to look there, giving the Red Brigade room to resolve what they actually wanted to achieve. And considering the blood they had already shed, their motives turned out to be remarkably muddled.
Moro's life depended entirely on how the Christian Democrats responded, on the fact that the Christian Democrats would acknowledge that there were political prisoners in Italy. That would mean recognizing the existence of an armed, revolutionary communist group.
To this rather obscure end, the Red Brigade declared that they intended to try Aldo Moro for crimes against the Italian people. A list of charges was sent to the national press, but neither the Christian Democrats nor the Communists were prepared to recognize this kangaroo court, or indeed the Red Brigade.
We were not a very strong state. We would not have gained anything from negotiating.
If it was right not to negotiate, then they should have found a way to free the prisoner. Or if it wasn't possible to free him, then they should have started negotiating. But doing neither of these was just like condemning him to death.
The Italian people were appalled and rallied to protest against terrorism. World leaders and even the Pope made pleas for his life. But 30 days after the kidnap, the Red Brigade declared that they had condemned Moro to death. Another 15 tense days passed.
We wanted him to come out alive. The hesitation and wavering of the other side had by then reached a point where the executive committee decided we had to cut the knot.
They cut the knot on the 9th of May at 10 a.m. Aldo Moro had been held for 55 days. His kidnappers, led by Mario Moretti, asked him to get into the back of a car in the garage of the apartment block, saying that he was to be moved and that he should cover himself with a blanket. Then 10 rounds from a .32 caliber machine pistol were fired, and Aldo Moro was dead.
Who fired the gun?
Moretti.
That morning, I was supposed to accompany the car with Moro's body in it to its final destination, via Caetani. It was an awful day. An awful day. I'd been the one who had contacted Moro's friends. So it now became my job to tell them where they could find his corpse.
Calling himself Dr. Nicolai, Valerio Marucci called a Moro family friend from Rome's main railway station.
Ma chi parla? Io voglio sapere chi parla. Brigata Rossa. Va bene? Lei deve comunicare alla famiglia che troveranno il corpo dell'onorevole Aldo Moro in via Caetani.
Non è stato un compito piacevole, né il primo, quello di fare.
It was not a nice job, and nor was the first one, escorting the car. But this second one was even worse. Messenger of death. Not at all good.
Per nulla bene.
Marucci and his comrades had parked the car containing Moro's body in central Rome. Symbolically, the spot lay midway between the headquarters of the Christian Democrats and the Communists, whose attempt at political union had proved so very deadly for Aldo Moro. The state laid on a lavish memorial service in central Rome, with the Pope presiding. Moro's family refused to attend. Instead, they buried his remains in a small village cemetery outside the city.
Personalmente io fui perseguitato.
Personally, I was haunted for many months, waking in the morning with the idea that I was an accomplice to his murder. The psychological guilt was balanced with rationally knowing that I could not have done anything else.
Razionale che non potevo fare diversamente.
Francesco Cossiga resigned as Minister of the Interior, only to become Prime Minister in just over a year and President in 1985. Valerio Marucci and his comrades went to prison. Che Guevara had written in 1960 that a revolution could be triggered even without popular support through a sufficiently drastic act. In cities all over the world, insurgent groups had tried to prove him right. The Red Brigade had hoped that the kidnap and murder of Aldo Moro might be the spark that lit the fire. In the end, the futility of the Moro affair marked the beginning of the end for Red Terror in Europe. The Italian people rallied against terrorism, while the Red Brigade itself began to splinter, unable to agree on just how violent they should be. But far away in Latin America, Che Guevara's legacy was still very much alive. The 20th of March 2002, a massive car bomb explodes in Lima on the eve of President George W. Bush's visit to Peru, killing 9 civilians. The prime suspect is one of the bloodiest terror groups ever, Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path. The Shining Path is believed to be responsible for over 6,000 murders in Peru. It began with one simple slogan.
The Shining Path used to write graffiti, saying, "People's War, People's War." The only answer was People's War. The People's War was going to change the whole planet, and it was going to begin in Peru.
This People's War was the brainchild of a philosophy professor based here at the university in a remote town in the Andean highlands called Ayacucho. His name was Abimael Guzman.
Abimael Guzman es un genocida.
Abimael Guzman is guilty of genocide. Abimael Guzman is the Bin Laden of Peru. If you were to double the number of people killed in the Twin Towers, you'll begin to get an idea of the suffering and human toll that has been incurred in Peru.
From his provincial base, Guzman devoted the 1970s to drawing up his blueprint for a Peruvian revolution, designed to liberate the poor. He followed Che Guevara's classic tactic of attempting to start an armed uprising in the countryside. The only difference was that Abimael Guzman opted for apocalyptically bloody methods.
Hay otra frase de Abimael Guzmán que dice, al final,
There's a saying of Abimael Guzman. In the end, we all must mix our warm blood with the cold blood of our dead brothers. In other words, this was a movement that admired death.
Admirador de la muerte.
But Guzman's message was easy to understand and appealing to his followers among the poor.
I remember when I went to school in a shanty town and had to sit on bricks. What happened in this country had to happen so there could be change. We, the people, were forced to shout out that we exist. To get basic fundamental rights, blood has had to be spilt.
Villages like Pacha, a 4-hour drive beyond Ayacucho, became the front line in Guzman's war. For as long as the Shining Path were killing landowners and policemen, people here believed that they were their saviors.
The people here felt they could relate to this movement because it said that it was going to fight for the poor. The Shining Path said that there was going to be no more poverty, that there was going to be equality. Never again would people have to go without food, clothing, education or health.
Guzman, who liked to call himself President Gonzalo, kept his distance from his followers. To them, he was a remote, shadowy, even romantic figure, almost a god.
Lo hacían sentir como el gran.
They made him feel like a great shepherd who had his flock around him. He was the absolute power. Without Abimael Guzman, there was no Shining Path.
No hubo sendero.
I didn't actually meet him personally, but I see him as one of the most brilliant people, one of the most brilliant intellectuals our country has ever had.
As the Shining Path's body count rose, the Peruvian army was sent in by the government to take them on. From the late 1980s, they would meet terror with terror. For every person the Shining Path killed, the army killed 6, a total death toll of nearly 40,000.
Al entrar la Fuerza Armada, que está preparada para enfrentar al enemigo externo.
When the army, which is trained to fight against foreign troops, became involved in counter-terrorist warfare,
no distingue.
It didn't differentiate between those who were not in the Shining Path and those who were.
No hace inteligencia.
It didn't do enough intelligence work beforehand. As a result, innocent people died and human rights were seriously violated.
Problemas de violaciones de derechos humanos.
The war of terror between the Peruvian army and the Shining Path had devastating consequences for villages like Pacha. Guzman's followers were determined to maintain their grip on the peasants and were prepared to be brutal to keep them in line. In response to that brutality, the villagers armed themselves against the Shining Path and began to inform the authorities about their movements. In the ever-increasing spiral of violence, the Shining Path now turned on the very people they had once promised to set free. On the 11th of December 1989, they arrived here in Pacha in search of supposed informers. We spoke to Otilia Silva Melgar, who was widowed by the Shining Path that day.
They got my husband out of the house by tricking him into thinking that there was a meeting in the square. They dragged my husband away from our home. They tied his hands together and took him to the square. There they killed him with stones and knives and bottles.
40 villagers died that day.
What the Shining Path actually didn't match their promises. What they did was the complete opposite to what they said they were going to do. We've lived like animals because when the Shining Path was on the prowl, nobody slept soundly. It was like a ghost town here. So we asked ourselves, what could we do? Well, what we did was to get ready to defend ourselves. We organized ourselves into countryside patrols to fight back, fight the terror.
As war raged in the countryside, Abimael Guzman opted for Che Guevara's time-honored guerrilla tactic. He took the war to the cities. Bombs started exploding in rich shopping areas of Lima. In just 7 months, the Shining Path detonated 40 bombs, costing nearly 120 lives. the state had to rethink its strategy fast. In 1991, an anti-terrorist squad was set up to track the violence to its heart. That heart was Abimael Guzman. After years of hard-line military reaction, a bit of basic surveillance paid off. They began to watch a house in a smart suburb of Lima, where a ballet dancer with vague Shining Path connections had her studio. The curtains at the upstairs windows were drawn day and night, and then, most tellingly, she was spotted buying outsized men's underwear along with what was known to be Guzman's brand of cigarettes. On the 12th of September 1992, the police stormed the house. A police camera recorded the arrest of Guzman and his lover, Elena.
Gonzalo.
2 days later, an extraordinary public spectacle. The terrible head of the Shining Path was finally revealed. The damage to the Shining Path was immense. Now all the world could see that Abimael Guzman was no Che Guevara.
Un misil Exocet.
It was like an Exocet missile going down the funnel of a ship.
Total.
It was a hammer blow. Firstly, people thought that Abimael Guzman was magical, that he was everywhere at once, but that nobody could see him.
Nadie lo ve.
Cumpliendo con nuestras tareas y conquistar las metas, los éxitos, la victoria.
Cuando lo agarran a Abimael Guzmán, sin torturarlo,
when they caught Abimael Guzman, he told the police, without torture, the names of 1,200 Shining Path squads all over the country.
200 cuadros senderistas en todo el país.
The whole infrastructure of the Shining Path came crashing down, thanks to Abimael Guzman.
Que entrega.
Guzman is currently held in a maximum security prison outside Lima. The cult of his personality lives on among small pockets of Shining Path terrorists still active in Peru. But it seems unlikely that his dark vision will ever dominate the Peruvian landscape as it once did. With the decline of the Shining Path, the heartland of revolutionary terror is now to be found to the north, in Colombia. This wilderness has become the stronghold of a leftist guerrilla movement, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC. Their desire for a Marxist revolution has made this area a front line in the United States' war on terror. It is now one of the most dangerous and unpredictable places in the world. And it was here we interviewed FARC's second-in-command, Raúl Reyes.
Hay que decir que el proceso revolucionario colombiano, el surgimiento.
The revolutionary process and the appearance of guerrillas in Colombia has come about as a result of the Cuban Revolution. Other revolutions from all over the world also had an impact. But yes, the Cuban Revolution exerted a huge influence on the formation of the guerrillas. The goal of the guerrillas, our ideology, is to fight for power. We are fighting to run the country.
FARC are the oldest and probably the most effective revolutionary terror group today. They emerged from the Colombian Civil War of the 1950s that claimed over 300,000 lives. And ever since 1964, they've been fighting the Colombian government. Unlike red terror groups in Europe, unlike even the Shining Path in Peru, FARC are an 18,000-strong army equipped with state-of-the-art weaponry. But are they, as they say, guerrillas, or are they terrorists?
La
The difference between a guerrilla and a terrorist is that the guerrilla is fighting social inequality, fighting for political freedom and to change the lives of the whole country. But the irony of all this is that people in power call these struggles acts of terrorism.
In the late 1990s, the Colombian government couldn't quite decide how to classify FARC. And in 1998, President Andrés Pastrana opened talks with the rebels. He ceded an area the size of Switzerland as a FARC safe haven. Off limits to the army, this demilitarized zone became known as FARC land. With a huge tract of land and towns like the rebel capital San Vicente under their control, it was soon clear that FARC had no interest in peace. What they wanted was to destroy the Colombian state. They cranked up the scale of their operations. In 1 year alone, the conflict cost 300,000 people their homes and 2,000 their lives.
Accidents happen, and accidents happen on both sides. When a battalion or a police checkpoint is going to be taken, a stray bullet might hit a civilian or several civilians. The bombings, the machine guns, the planes, they all destroy civilian houses and civilians die. But sadly, we know that in war, the unexpected happens.
FARC pays for its war for freedom with Colombia's most famous export. 75% of the world's cocaine comes from here. And experts estimate that FARC makes over $500 million from drugs every year. Deep in FARC land, this coca plantation and processing laboratory is one of many which operate with impunity here and out of government control. What's more, FARC admit that they earn money from the drugs trade.
La ley 002, con el que se cobra un impuesto. Aquellos capitales...
FARC has law 002. This taxes people with more than $1 million in capital. It doesn't matter whether it comes from drug trafficking, coffee, soya, or cotton. All that matters is that they pay the tax.
To the United States, this isn't taxation, but narco-terrorism. In 2000, they pledged $1.3 billion of military aid into Colombia to help the government fight a war on drugs. And in this part of the world, a war on drugs is a war on FARC.
Están muy mal informados los estadounidenses. Y es lamentable porque es un...
The United States has been very badly informed. It's a shame because they're a very advanced country and have lots of ways of getting their facts right.
Ve uno que están muy distanciados de la realidad.
But it's clear they're far from the truth. They know that FARC are revolutionaries, a movement fighting for political change.
Está luchando por cambios políticos.
But for a movement claiming to fight only for political change, FARC have begun to look more and more like terrorists. In August 2001, a visit by 3 Irishmen raised the spectre of even bloodier FARC ambitions. On the 11th of August, 2 convicted IRA bomb experts and Sinn Féin's man in Cuba, Niall Connolly, were detained in Bogotá after a visit to FARC land. They claimed they were on holiday, but they were traveling under false passports, and 4 types of explosives were found on their clothing.
De lo que le están inculpando habían hecho.
They weren't doing any of the things that they've been accused of doing. They haven't been training FARC here. FARC already has 37 years of military experience. What were they going to teach us?
Intelligence sources have a pretty good idea. They believe that the IRA men were passing on the technology for a new kind of mortar for use in bombing Colombia's cities. Like the IRA and other Irish terror groups that have financed their terrorism through crime, FARC too has moved from the overtly political into kidnapping, extortion, and drug trafficking. Their denials of terrorist activity seem to mock President Pastrana's peace process. Then, on the 20th of February 2002, FARC hijacked an aeroplane with 31 people on board. It was a classic terror tactic. News of the incident came through while we were filming our interview with Raul Reyes in the FARC-held area. We asked him what was going on.
I know nothing about the hijacking. The only information I have, I got from the media. I know nothing more.
Within hours, all the hostages were released, except two, the head of the Colombian Peace Commission and his assistant. It left the government and President Pastrana in no doubt about who was responsible. FARC.
Colombia entera dice no más. Nos cansamos de la hipocresía de la guerrilla. O son un grupo de insurgencia política o son una organización terrorista. Las FARC optaron por el terrorismo.
The next day, we were detained at a FARC roadblock and filmed the Colombian army as it began to retake the demilitarized zone. As FARC burnt cars, blew up bridges, kidnapped politicians and journalists, military helicopters supplied by the US began to fly over the region, searching for drug labs and FARC bases to bomb. Here, they engaged FARC guerrillas less than 400 meters from our film crew. Within just 2 days, San Vicente was occupied by the Colombian army, and in a scrum of international press, Pastrana arrived to declare the zone part of Colombia again. But FARC have promised to fight to the death, and here in Colombia, the war on terror really means war. Che Guevara said, if a revolution is true, you will either triumph or die. In Germany, his Baader-Meinhof followers murdered, the leaders committed suicide, and it was all for nothing.
I have done what I've done, and I have to live with it, and I have to live with this broken picture.
In Italy, it was the Red Brigade, and their killing spree was just as pointless.
Dopo si capisce che le persone coinvolte.
Later, you understand that the people we killed did not deserve this.
Non meritavano di essere coinvolte.
In Peru, it was the Shining Path who slaughtered thousands of their countrymen.
We don't ever want to meet that wolf in sheep's clothing again. Those days were truly terrible.
But in Colombia, FARC's war of terror goes on.
You either triumph or die when you struggle for revolution. But the ideas don't die. The objectives don't die. People die.
People continue to die. But so far, no revolutionary terror group has achieved its revolution.